The first thing Arthur Finch saw was the color purple, a splash of it so deep and wrong against the beige dust of the Nevada desert it made his eyes ache. It was the color of a twilight sky, of a rare desert flower. But here, tangled in the splintered remains of a wagon wheel, it was the color of catastrophe. He reined in his black gelding, Shadow, the horse snorting nervously at the scent that hung in the oppressive summer air. It was the coppery smell of ruin, a scent Arthur knew from his time in the war, one he had prayed he would never encounter on this parched scrap of land he was trying to call home. He dismounted, the worn leather of his boots sinking into the hot sand. The scene was a quiet monument to violence. 2 wagons, one overturned, its canvas top slashed to ribbons. The bodies of the drivers and guards were scattered, left where they fell. They were white men, hired guns by the look of them. Further on lay the bodies of 3 Chinese men in simple dark tunics, their hands empty, their expressions frozen in shock. A robbery, but a brutally thorough one. The attackers had not just taken valuables, they had taken lives with a chilling finality. Arthur's ranch was failing. The creek was a ghost of its former self. His cattle were thin, and the $300 he owed Jedediah Croft for the land note was a mountain he could not see the top of. He was out here today on a fool's errand, chasing rumors of a hidden spring in the foothills, a last desperate hope. Finding this massacre felt like the land's final, cruel answer to his prayers. He should have turned back, ridden straight to the sheriff in Argenta, 20 miles east. That was the sensible thing to do. That was the safe thing to do. But then he saw the purple again. It wasn't just a piece of cloth. It was a dress, clinging to a small figure huddled against the far side of the overturned wagon, partially shielded from view. He approached slowly, his hand resting on the worn grip of the Colt at his hip, a precaution that felt hollow in the face of such complete devastation. He expected to find another victim. He was not prepared to find a survivor. She was a young woman, Chinese, her face smudged with dirt and tears, her intricate black hair having come loose from its pins. The purple dress, a cheongsam of a style he'd never seen before, was made of a fine, smooth silk, now torn at the hem and stained with dust. One sleeve was ripped, revealing a long, scraped arm. She was unconscious, but her breathing was shallow and steady. In her arms, she clutched a small black lacquered box, holding it to her chest like a prayer. For a long moment, Arthur just stood there, the desert sun beating down on him. Leaving her was a death sentence. The heat alone would claim her by noon. Taking her to Argenta was a risk. Who knew what kind of trouble had followed these people? The men who did this were not common bandits. They were butchers. Bringing her back to his ranch, that was madness. He had barely enough water for himself and his stock. He had a dwindling sack of flour and a side of bacon to last him the month. Taking on another mouth to feed, a stranger, a woman who was clearly part of something far outside his understanding, was the most foolish thing he could possibly do. He looked at her face, peaceful in its exhaustion, and then at the brutal scene around them. He saw the empty water barrels, cracked open and spilled into the sand. This wasn't just a robbery. It was an execution. He thought of Croft, of the coldness in the man's eyes when he'd spoken of foreclosure. He thought of the loneliness of his cabin, the silence that pressed in on him night after night. His life was already a wreck. What was one more complication? With a sigh that seemed to pull up all the dust and disappointment of the past year, Arthur knelt. He gently tried to pry the lacquered box from her grip, thinking to lighten his load, but her fingers were locked tight, even in unconsciousness. He gave up. Carefully, he slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. He carried her to Shadow, who watched the proceedings with intelligent, dark eyes. The horse didn't shy away as Arthur mounted, settling the woman in front of him. She stirred, a soft moan escaping her lips, but did not wake. He turned Shadow away from the carnage, away from the path to Argenta, and back toward the dusty trail that led to his failing homestead. He did not yet know that the woman in his arms was a princess, or that the box she held contained a secret that could destroy the most powerful man in the territory. All he knew was that he couldn't leave her to die. And in the harsh arithmetic of the frontier, that single act of foolish courage was about to change the value of everything. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment she lay perfectly still on the narrow cot, her mind a fog of terror and confusion. The last thing she remembered was the splintering of wood, the screams, the terrifying emptiness in the eyes of the man who had torn the locket from her guard's neck. Then, darkness. Now there was a rough wool blanket over her, a clean, if lumpy, pillow beneath her head, and the quiet sounds of a man moving around a small room. She opened her eyes. The cabin was a single room, built of sturdy pine, with a stone hearth at one end where a small fire crackled. A man stood with his back to her, his shoulders broad under a faded blue shirt. He was tall, with sun-bleached brown hair. He moved with a quiet economy, pouring coffee from a tin pot into a chipped ceramic mug. This was not one of the attackers. His presence felt different, calm. Arthur heard the rustle of the blanket and turned. He saw her watching him, her eyes wide and dark, filled with a cautious intelligence. He offered a small, hesitant smile. "Morning, ma'am," he said softly. He held up a canteen. "Water?" She pushed herself up, wincing as her bruised muscles protested. She looked down at her hands, then at the lacquered box, which was sitting safely on the small crate next to the cot. Relief washed over her face, a subtle softening of her features. She nodded, her gaze fixed on him. He brought the canteen and a tin cup over, pouring the water for her. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if trying not to spook a deer. She took the cup with both hands, her fingers trembling slightly. She drank deeply, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. When she was done, she looked at him and spoke a single word, her voice raspy. "Shie." Arthur didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. "You're welcome," he replied. He gestured to the skillet on the fire. "I've got bacon, and I can make some flapjacks. You hungry?" She just stared at him, her brow furrowed in concentration. She clearly didn't understand. This was going to be harder than he thought. He pointed to his mouth, made a chewing motion, and then pointed to her. A flicker of comprehension crossed her face. She gave a small, hesitant nod. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. He learned her name was May. She said it while pointing to her own chest, her voice clear and musical despite the circumstances. He told her his was Arthur. They communicated mostly through gestures and single words. He'd point to the horse and say, "Shadow." She would repeat it, "Sha-dow," her pronunciation careful. She learned water, food, sun, and moon. He learned that the lacquered box was never to be touched. She kept it with her always, and when he had once reached for it to move it aside, her reaction had been sharp and fierce, a sudden intake of breath and a protective stance that told him more than any words could. He saw that beneath the dirt and the fear, she was possessed of a powerful grace. She moved with a quiet dignity, even in his rough-hewn cabin. After he gave her a clean shirt of his and a spare set of trousers to wear while he washed her torn dress, she folded her soiled finery with a reverence that surprised him. The purple silk, even ripped and stained, was clearly precious to her. He found her once, running her fingers over the embroidered peonies on the collar, her expression one of profound loss. Trouble arrived on the fourth day in the form of a dust cloud on the horizon. It resolved itself into a buggy pulled by a handsome gray mare. Jedediah Croft did not look like a predator. He was a man in his 50s, with a neatly trimmed beard, a clean suit, and a paternal smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was the wealthiest man in the county, owning the general store, the saloon, and the water rights to 3/4 of the valley. "Arthur," he called out, pulling the buggy to a halt near the porch. "Just making my rounds. Thought I'd see how you were faring in this heat." Arthur's stomach tightened. He stepped out of the cabin, making sure to block the doorway. "Mr. Croft, I'm managing." Croft's eyes scanned the property, taking in the thin cattle, the dusty corral, the general air of struggle. "Managing," he repeated, his tone smooth as polished stone. "That's good to hear. You know, the note comes due at the end of the month. I'm a patient man, Arthur, but business is business." "I'll have it," Arthur lied, his voice tight. It was then that Croft's gaze shifted, looking past Arthur's shoulder into the dim interior of the cabin. May had moved to the window, curious about the visitor. Croft's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by an intense, hungry curiosity. His eyes narrowed, taking in her delicate features, her foreignness. "Well now, who is this?" he asked, his voice losing its folksy warmth. "You've taken on help?" "She's a traveler. Ran into some trouble on the trail," Arthur said, his tone clipped. Croft's eyes gleamed with a disturbing light. "Trouble, you say? A woman like that, alone out here? She could fetch a pretty penny in the mining camps. A man could solve a lot of his financial problems with that kind of windfall." He said it conversationally, as if discussing the price of grain. A cold anger, sharp and pure, cut through Arthur's fear. He straightened up, his hand moving away from his side, his posture losing its deferential slump. "She's not for sale," he said, his voice low and steady. "She's under my protection." Croft stared at him, the pleasant mask falling away completely. For a moment, Arthur saw the man beneath, cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. Then the smile was back, wider and more unpleasant than before. "Your protection," Croft mused, as if tasting the words. "A noble sentiment, Arthur. A noble and expensive sentiment. Don't forget about that note." He tipped his hat, a gesture of mocking politeness, and turned the buggy around, leaving Arthur standing in a cloud of dust and quiet menace. May came to stand in the doorway behind him. She hadn't understood the words, but she had understood the threat in Croft's voice, the avarice in his eyes. She looked from the departing buggy to Arthur's face, at the hard line of his jaw. He had stood up for her, a stranger, against a man who clearly held power over him. Later that evening, as Arthur was checking the latch on the cabin door for the third time, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Down by the well, barely visible in the fading light, were fresh hoof prints. They weren't his, and they weren't from Croft's buggy. Someone had been there, watching from a distance, hidden in the scrub brush. Croft's visit hadn't been a chance encounter. He was sniffing around, hunting, and his interest was not just in Arthur's land anymore. It was in his guest, and in the secrets she carried. The danger was no longer a vague threat on the horizon. It was now circling his home, silent and waiting. The heat broke that night. The sky, which had been a merciless, empty blue for weeks, turned a bruised gray. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin's lone window and carrying the scent of distant rain. Inside, the small space felt like a fortress against the coming storm. Arthur had barred the door and sat at the simple wooden table, cleaning his rifle, the methodical clicks and oiled scrapes a comforting sound in the growing dark. May sat on her cot, the lacquered box on her lap. The tension from Croft's visit lingered in the air between them. She had watched Arthur all afternoon, a new understanding in her eyes. She had seen him move with purpose, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon, his calm demeanor replaced by a sharp-edged vigilance. He was afraid, she realized, but he was not weak. The first drops of rain hit the roof, soft at first, then harder, a steady drumming that washed away the silence. The sound seemed to loosen something in the room. May looked at Arthur, then at the dying embers in the hearth. She stood, picked up a piece of charcoal from the stone surround, and knelt on the floorboards. Arthur stopped his work, watching her. In the flickering lamplight, her face was a study in concentration. She began to draw. Her first sketch was crude, but unmistakable. A great ship with 3 masts, waves crashing against its hull. Then she drew a boxy shape with wheels on a track. A train. She looked at him, her eyes questioning. "A ship," Arthur said, pointing, "and a train." She nodded, a small, sad smile touching her lips. She continued her story in charcoal. She drew a wagon, much like the ones he'd found, and then a group of figures. She drew herself, a simple stick figure in a dress, and then drew several men around her, 2 with hats like the guards he'd found, and 3 others. She pointed to them. "Brothers," she said, her voice soft. It was one of the few words he'd taught her. Guards. Her hand began to shake as she drew the next part. She drew other figures, men on horseback, their faces obscured. But on the saddle of one of the horses she drew a symbol. It was a circle with a crossbar through it. A brand. Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. He knew that brand. It belonged to the Croft Mercantile and Freight Company. Officially, Jedediah Croft only shipped dry goods and mining equipment. Unofficially, it was rumored he used his wagons for less savory work. Moving undeclared gold from illegal mines, smuggling liquor into dry territories. Arthur had never paid the rumors much mind. Now they felt like a death sentence. The picture was horribly clear. Croft hadn't just stumbled upon the massacre's survivor. His men had been the cause. May wiped away the drawing of the attack with the heel of her hand, smearing the charcoal into a gray blur. Her face was pale. She looked at Arthur, her expression pleading, as if begging him to understand. Then, with deliberate movements, she placed her hand on the lacquered box. She hesitated for a second, then slid open the small, hidden latch on its side. Arthur had expected gold, or perhaps jewels, something worth killing for. He was wrong. The box was lined with red silk, and nestled inside were 2 objects. The first was a seal, carved from a solid piece of pale green jade. It was heavy, cool to the touch, and intricately decorated with a coiling dragon. It was an object of immense quality and value, but it wasn't treasure in the way a bandit would understand. The second object was a sheaf of papers, tied with a silk ribbon. May carefully lifted them out and handed them to him. The top document was written in English, in a precise, elegant script. It was a land deed, officially stamped and registered with the territorial office in California. But the name on the deed was not one Arthur recognized. It was granted to a man named Wei Zhao for the purchase of 5,000 acres of prime valley land east of Sacramento. The purchase price listed was $50,000 in gold coin, a staggering sum, marked as paid in full. Tucked within the deed was a letter, also in English. It was from Wei Zhao to his daughter, May. It spoke of his dream to build a new home, a sanctuary called Morning Sun Valley, for their family and for other Chinese immigrants seeking a life free from the persecution they faced in the mining camps and railroad towns. He had sent her, his cleverest and bravest child, with the seal, the symbol of his authority, and the deed, to legally claim the land and begin the work. She was not just a merchant's daughter. She was an envoy, a founder, a princess of a different sort, entrusted with the future of her people. The massacre wasn't a robbery. It was a targeted assassination, an attempt to steal not just a wagon, but a future. Croft must have learned of the land deal, of the vast wealth behind it, and decided to take it for himself. With May and the deed gone, the land would fall into legal limbo, and a man with Croft's resources and lack of scruples could easily forge a new claim. A sudden violent bang on the cabin door made them both jump. "Arthur!" It was Croft's voice, but the paternal warmth was gone, replaced by a raw, impatient anger. "I know she's in there. Open this door." Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked from the deed in his hands to May's terrified face. He had thought he was protecting a helpless victim. He now understood he was guarding a queen and her kingdom. Another crash came against the door, the wood groaning in protest. He could hear other voices now, rough and low. Croft hadn't come back alone. Arthur reacted without thinking. He grabbed the papers from the table, shoving them inside his own shirt. He took the jade seal from May's hands, its weight a solid, cold reality, and tucked it into his saddlebag hanging by the door. "Come," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the back of the cabin, where a small, shuttered window looked out into the stormy darkness. The front door splintered, then burst open. 3 figures filled the doorway. Croft stood in the middle, his face contorted with rage, flanked by 2 hard-faced men holding pistols. "There's nowhere to run, Finch," Croft bellowed over the sound of the storm. But Arthur wasn't trying to run. He was a rancher, not a fighter. He knew the land, not the gun. He unlatched the rear window and pushed it open. Outside, the rain was a torrential downpour. The small creek bed that ran behind his cabin, dry for months, was now a rushing, muddy torrent. It was their only chance. He shoved his rifle into May's hands. "Hold this," he commanded. He climbed out the window, sinking to his knees in the thick mud. He turned and held out his arms for her. For a heartbeat she hesitated, her eyes locked on the men advancing into the cabin. Then she trusted him. She handed the rifle out and scrambled through the window into his arms. He set her on her feet, took the rifle back, and grabbed her hand. They plunged into the darkness, the roar of the storm and the rising creek swallowing the sounds of Croft's furious shouts behind them. They were running not just for their lives, but for the deed tucked against Arthur's heart and the jade dragon heavy in his bag. The ride to Argenta was a special kind of hell. The storm turned the landscape into a treacherous maze of mud and rising water. Arthur kept them off the main trail, sticking to the ridges he knew, where the ground was rockier and held firmer. Shadow, his steady gelding, was magnificent, navigating the slick terrain with an almost human intelligence, his breath pluming in the cold, wet air. May clung to Arthur, her face pressed against his back, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. He could feel the tremors running through her, but she made no sound, no complaint. She was a silent, resolute partner in their desperate flight. They didn't stop until the first gray light of dawn broke through the clouds, revealing a washed-out world. They were miles from the ranch, hidden in a small canyon. Argenta was still 10 miles away. Arthur slid from the saddle, his body aching with exhaustion, and helped May down. Her face was pale and stained with mud, but her eyes were clear. He offered her the last of his water from the canteen. As she drank, he pulled the papers from his shirt. They were damp, but the ink had held. He looked at the deed, at the dream of Morning Sun Valley spelled out in elegant script. It felt impossibly heavy. "Croft," May said, her voice quiet but firm. She pointed back in the direction they'd come, then made a gesture with her hand, a closing fist. She understood. She knew what Croft wanted, and she knew they were all that stood in his way. It took them the rest of the morning to reach the town. Argenta wasn't much more than a single dusty street lined with clapboard buildings. The largest of them had a sign that read, Croft Mercantile. Arthur led Shadow right past it, his gaze fixed on the small sheriff's office at the end of the street. The sheriff was a weary man named Hobbs, with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much. He listened to Arthur's frantic story with skepticism, glancing from Arthur's mud-caked appearance to the silent Chinese woman beside him. "Jedediah Croft," Hobbs said, rubbing his jaw. "Arthur, that's a mighty big accusation. Croft practically owns this town. You got any proof?" For an answer, Arthur laid the damp deed on the desk. He then took out the heavy jade seal and placed it beside the papers. Hobbs stared at the objects. He wasn't a scholar, but he knew quality when he saw it. The seal radiated an aura of ancient authority that no frontier forger could ever hope to replicate. He picked up the deed and read the first few lines, his eyebrows climbing his forehead. 5,000 acres. Paid in full? He breathed. He looked at May, then back at Arthur. This is real? The men who attacked her wagon wore the brand of Croft's Freight Company, Arthur said simply. I saw it myself. He came to my ranch. He tried to take her. Then he came back to kill us both. The arrival of the telegraphic reply from the U.S. Marshal's office in Sacramento 3 days later was what broke the case open. The deed was legal. The land purchase was one of the largest private transactions in California that year. And Wei Zhao was not just a merchant. He was a former diplomat with powerful friends in both San Francisco and Washington. An investigation was launched, not by a local sheriff, but by federal marshals. Faced with the deed, the seal, and May's testimony, delivered through a translator brought from the city, Croft's empire of intimidation collapsed. Men who had long feared him began to talk. The story of the Wagon Massacre was just the final, brutal chapter in a long history of greed. Croft and his men were arrested, their reign over the valley ending not with a bang, but with the clank of iron shackles. 3 months later, the sun was not a punishing enemy, but a warm, life-giving presence. It shone down on a wide green valley in California, where the grass grew thick and a clear river snaked its way toward the sea. This was Morning Sun Valley. The first structures were going up, not rough cabins, but thoughtfully designed houses built around a central common green. The air was filled with the sound of hammers and saws, and the murmur of conversation in both English and Chinese. Arthur stood on a small rise overlooking the burgeoning settlement. He was no longer the gaunt, desperate man from the Nevada desert. His shoulders were straight, his face had filled out, and he wore clean, sturdy work clothes. He had sold his parched homestead and all his worldly possessions for a pittance, but May had refused to let him walk away. She had insisted, through her translator, that he was a founder. With the money from his sale, he had bought into the new venture, not as a hired hand, but as a partner. He was in charge of the livestock and the planning of the ranches that would sustain the community. A small herd of healthy cattle grazed in a nearby pasture. A fine black horse, Shadow, stood contentedly by a new-built corral. His life was no longer about mere survival. It was about building. May came to stand beside him. She wore a simple American-style dress of blue cotton, practical for her work overseeing the settlement's establishment. But tied in her long dark hair was a simple ribbon. It was the color of deep twilight, the color purple. She followed his gaze out over the valley. "It is good," she said. Her English was much better now, practiced every day with him and the other American carpenters and surveyors she had hired. "It is," Arthur agreed. His own small house was being built near the river, a stone's throw from the larger home being constructed for her and the family she hoped would soon join her. For a long time they stood in comfortable silence, a silence that was no longer about a language barrier, but about a shared understanding that ran deeper than words. He had found her as a broken survivor in the dust. He had offered her water, shelter, and the flimsy shield of his own failing courage. In return, she had given him a world. She had seen the strength in him he hadn't seen in himself. He looked at the purple ribbon in her hair. The color no longer reminded him of catastrophe. Now, against the backdrop of the green valley and the hopeful blue sky, it looked like a promise. He had thought his story was about losing a ranch. He had been wrong. His story was about finding a home in the most unexpected way imaginable. He had saved a life, but she had redeemed his. They were two survivors from two different worlds, building a future together, one that was richer than any land deed and more precious than any jade seal. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.